So I'm going to tell the story of the day I was interrogated in a murder investigation. I view myself as a fairly intelligent, level-minded sort of person, doing well in, emergency situations, just being calm and cool and collected when I need to be. So one morning, I remember I was playing rock music. We had, I think I had Pearl Jam on pretty loud, and I was making cookies. And we were desperately trying to clean the house because we had people coming over to go swimming later that afternoon. And I just had the younger 4 kids at the house. The older 2 were gone. So it was chaotic, but lots of noise, lots of running around. And there was a knock on our front door. And at this point, I was literally wearing a ratty old t-shirt from college, just shorts. I hadn't taken a shower yet. I was making cookies. I had flour all over me. So I ran to the front door, and a man was standing there, and he said,
"Are you Rebecca Mlinick?"
And I said, "Yes." And he noticed my t-shirt, and he said,
"Actually, this is what I need to talk to you about. I'm so-and-so, the Crimes Against Children Unit. I need to speak with you."
He did not show me his badge. It didn't occur to me to ask for his badge. This complete stranger and standing at the door. I didn't ask him a single question. I just said, "Oh, okay." And I let him inside. And then I said to my 9-year-old, "Can you please take your younger sisters and go downstairs? And I'm going to talk to this man, and I'll tell you when you can come up." So she took them all downstairs, and I invited the detective to sit at the table, which was dirty, I remember very clearly. I asked him if he wanted a glass of water. He said,
"No, thank you."
Then he asked me if I'd turn the music down. So I did. I pulled the cookies out of the oven, and he started asking me about a friend of ours from college. This friend, his name was Dan. One of his addresses that was sort of listed under his name was our address. And that's because he had followed a girl to Arizona like a year or 2 previous to that. And when he moved, he wasn't sure the stuff with the girl was going to work out. So he had rented a storage unit, and he needed to have an address, for the storage unit. So we put down our address. So that's how he was listed as a resident in our house. So he started asking me about this friend, at which point I was concerned about my friend. And I said, is Dan okay? Is this about Dan? And the detective proceeded to explain to me that there had been a murder of a young girl who was 18 years old in Pigtown, which is like a part of downtown Baltimore, in the early 2000s. And that a man had been arrested in the murder, but that they had always suspected that he had been paid to commit this murder. This girl had been dating an opera singer, actually, and they suspected that the opera singer boyfriend had something to do with this murder, but they'd never been able to connect him to it. And as it turned out, the opera singer was from the same town in Colorado as the killer, and they were both from the same town in Colorado as our friend Dan Eagle. They both bought houses in the same neighborhood right around the same time. And then Dan had, for a while, he was sort of flipping houses. He bought a house in Pigtown, and he had rehabbed it, and he had fixed it all up. And right around that same period, the man who, killed this girl, he also was living in Pigtown. And that is why Dan was under suspicion for murder. So I immediately, this was just absurd. Dan is not a murderer. He's just a hapless, nice guy. Followed this girl to Arizona. He's still living there. She's not going to marry him, and he's still just sort of hanging out at her beck and call. She breaks up with him every couple of months and then calls him back when she's bored. And that's the sort of guy he is. So I immediately knew that this was just a weird set of coincidence. I mean, I deep in my heart believed that Dan was not a murderer. Dan is not a murderer. However, I just could not stop talking. I felt like I was Chunk from the Goonies, where, he had my hand over a blender, and I just started talking about when I was in kindergarten, I stole Joey Hubble-Double's crayon.
I never felt so bad in my entire life.
I'm beginning to like this kid, man.
Hit puree!
No! I'm too young!
I just told him everything. So he asked me about our friends from college. He was asking if Dan had come into any money. He was asking if people had had any trouble with the law. And the one friend who had been at in college with us and had moved as well with us. His name was Chris. And the detective hadn't asked me anything about him. I think that's probably because Chris Lober had taken some time off in college. For a while, he thought he was going to be a farmer, and that failed, so he came back. So his record, most likely, at Steubenville was somewhat inconsistent because he sort of left, came back, left, came back. So the detective hadn't asked me about him. And he asked, when he was asking about troubles with the law, I said, oh, well, no, we did have one friend who was investigated by the FBI. When the dot-com bust happened, the president was more or less corrupt, and he started suing some of the employees, saying that they were stealing trade secrets from the company, and eventually the Lobers were completely cleared of all of these charges. They were all trumped up. It was silly. But there were a couple of years where, the FBI came and they searched his house and they confiscated his computers, and it was this whole deal. So I told him all about this, and he was like,
Oh, Chris Lober. I didn't have him in my notes.
so he started taking this all down. And he asked, he was asking if Dan had ever come into money unexpectedly. And I started laughing. I said, no, Dan was always struggling for money. And I told him this story about how when Dan was rehabbing the house in Pigtown, he had all of this equipment that he was using to, finish the floors and refurbish and do the walls and all of that kind of stuff. And he would pay homeless guys in the area to watch his house when he wasn't there because theft was a real problem. And he came home one day and a bunch of his equipment had been stolen. So, he went to one of the homeless guys outside and he was like,
Oh, I think Sneaking Pete down at the bar in the corner knows something about that.
So Dan went to the bar in the corner and he found Sneaky Pete, and Sneaky Pete said,
I do know where your equipment is, and you just need to turn around and go back home if you don't want to get hurt.
and Dan at this point realized he was outmatched, that he was not going to get his equipment back, and he just needed to turn around and go home and be safe. So the detective, wanted to talk to my husband. So I said, well, he'll be back later. And he said,
Okay, well, I'm going to come back later then.
it was a solid hour and a half. By the time we were done, the people who were coming to swim were there. So we left, and I immediately called my husband, and I said, you're not going to believe what happened. So, immediately my husband, because, he's a big fan of 70s crime movies, I don't know, he was immediately like,
Well, you didn't tell him about Lober, right? And the FBI.
and I said, oh, actually, yeah, I did. And he said,
You didn't tell him about Dan and having all the stuff stolen?
and I said, yeah, he didn't ask about that, but I told him. And Chris, my husband, said,
Why would you tell him that? Okay, so when he comes back, if he gets there before me, just don't talk. Let me do the talking.
so we came home, and the detective came back, and he sat down, and he was talking with my husband for maybe 10 minutes. And the detective said to my husband,
Well, you've just saved the city of Baltimore quite a bit of money. I was about to book my plane ticket to go to Arizona to find Dan Eagle. After speaking with your wife, I was more convinced than ever that we got the guy.
and the detective explained that he'd actually moved on. He wasn't with this department anymore, and this was one of those cases that had always haunted him. It really bugged him. So he continued to work on it in his off time. He'd just been scouring things, and this seemed like a long shot kind of a lead. I mean, he could see the timeline was a little bit off between when all of this happened and Dan Eagle's timeline, but he was going to follow up on everything just to see. And that, after speaking with me, he was very excited. He thought he had maybe found his murderer. And it's just an understood thing in the family now. If anybody commits a crime, the first thing they need to make sure is that I know nothing about it. No one can tell me anything, because I will crack under pressure. It's a good thing that he also spoke with my husband, because he was able to clear our friend's name. And that's the story of how I very nearly almost got a good friend convicted of murder.